This presentation includes material that was covered in course TRC3320, the pre-OT course, starting from March 28th through April 11th. It contains information on our wrap-up of our ethics topic, the Code of Ethics for Occupational Therapy, and it includes the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework. Starting with slide number 65, the following will be the lecture material that we did not have a chance to cover during class due to a couple of missed classes. So the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework includes two parts, as I mentioned previously, which is the domain and then process. We've covered domain already in class. Please go back and review slides 1 through 64. Actually, it's a little bit later than that because a few of those slides are for the Code of Ethics. But those slides we did have a chance to cover in class, and you can review that material on your own. Starting with slide number 65, the lecture will continue with Occupational Therapy Practice Framework process. So just as an overview, I'll provide a background of what we mean when we refer to the OT process. There will be a brief mention of the philosophical foundations, and then we'll cover key concepts of the OT process that will be discussed in greater detail as we move forward. Essentially, what you need to know for the final will include the 3 steps of the OT process, which includes evaluation, intervention, and outcome. So we'll cover those 3 and go into greater detail. And you can also refer to chapter 12 for more detail. Lastly, we'll summarize with the 3 key points of the entire lecture, domain and process of the OTPF. So if we return to our discussion on the philosophical foundations of OT, we need to keep in mind 3 very important points. Through the therapeutic use of occupation and activity, the client is involved on many levels. Coordination between the person's sensory motor, cognitive, and psychosocial systems is necessary and elicited when an individual engages in occupations and activities. And we talked about how OT practitioners use occupation and activity as a means to help a client learn a new skill, restore deficient ability, and compensate in the presence of functional disability, maintain health, or prevent dysfunction. So here in the last point, there are several words that should be emphasized. Occupation and activity as a means. If you recall from our lecture, we talked about occupation as means and end. Also keep in mind that occupational therapy is provided in order to restore, to compensate, to maintain, and also prevent dysfunction. So all of those words are key terms to keep in mind as we continue with the lecture. What do we mean when we say occupation as means and end? Occupation as a means, as a review, is the use of a specific occupation to bring about a change in the client's performance. Occupation as an end is the desired outcome or product of intervention. In other words, the performance of activities or tasks that the person deems as important to life, and it is derived from the person's values, experiences, and culture. And here's a quote that for those of you who continue on to occupational therapy school, you will more than likely see this come up again. But it's a quote by Mary Riley, who summarized the concept of occupation as means and ends when she stated the following: Man, through the use of his hands, as they are energized by mind and will, can influence the state of his own health. And if you recall, Mary Riley is one of the pioneers of the occupational therapy profession. That's just a little review for your final. So now that we've established that the analysis of activity and occupation is unique to OT, how do we conduct the analysis of this therapeutic process? When we say therapeutic process, we're referring to evaluation, assessment, and outcome. According to the OTPF, key points of the OT process include the following key points. Now, we covered all of this information up to this point in our last class, so this should be a review. But let's go back over the key points of the OT process. The process outlined is dynamic and interactive in nature. Keeping in mind, when we say dynamic, we mean that it's ever changing. Always changing. It's not static. It doesn't stay the same. 2, context is an overarching, underlying, and embedded influence on the process of service delivery. We're going to revisit context in a few moments. 3, the term client is used to name the entity who receives occupational therapy services. 4, a client-centered approach is used throughout the framework. And 5, engagement in occupation is viewed as the overarching outcome of the occupational therapy process. Keep these 5 key points in mind as we continue. Again, just to emphasize this point, the occupational therapy practice framework outlines process by taking a look at the 3 different steps of the OT process. Evaluation is the first step, intervention is the second step, and then outcome is our third step. And the main parts that you need to remember for the final would be evaluation, intervention, and outcome. However, if you're ambitious and you'd like to remember the detailed version of this particular diagram, or this particular diagram, that's fine. So important points to consider, and again, this is a review. OT is primarily responsible for the evaluation and interpretation of assessments. The OTA may assist the OT and contribute to the evaluation by providing data after service competency has been determined. What do we mean by service competency? It refers to verifying that the OTA is able to produce similar consistent results as the OT. And the OTA is not responsible for the interpretation of the results. The OT is responsible for the interpretation of the results, and the OT is responsible for developing an intervention plan based on the results of the evaluation. So most of this you should recall from an earlier lecture when we compared the roles and responsibilities of the OT versus the OTA. Now to take a closer look at the evaluation process. Evaluation includes the following: an occupational profile, which provides background information on the client's goals, habits, occupations, and history. Generally, this is obtained through an interview with the client. However, the information can be obtained by using assessments. See the chart on page 85 of your book, your textbook. Analysis of occupational performance is another aspect of the evaluation, which includes actually, for example, observing a student, if I'm a school-based OT, observing a student across the school environment, which can be on the playground, to see how the student interacts with his or her peers, in the lunchroom or in the cafeteria, to observe whether or not the student is able to open a milk carton independently, whether or not they're actually completing a meal, whether they're able to focus on why they're there, feeding themselves, whether they're able to follow directions, etc. It may also include, or assessment may also include going into the student's classroom, interviewing the teacher about the student, gathering additional information by looking at the student's work, and so on. Next, evaluation involves use of a client-centered approach, which we mentioned a few slides back, during which the OT practitioner is interested in the client's viewpoint, the client's narrative, and the client's desires. And then the OT determines occupations of interest based on that feedback from the client. A client-centered approach involves working collaboratively with clients and is considered a foundational component of OT. So I cannot stress that word enough, collaboratively. Other important points to note about the OT process, specifically evaluation, includes that during the evaluation, the OT analyzes the client's performance skills and client factors to determine the client's strengths and limitations. These terms, client's performance or client performance skills and client factors, should ring a bell with you. And if they do not, please go back and look at the earlier slide that contains the chart on which these terms are mentioned. The OT may choose to use formal assessments, including standardized tests or protocols. So let me distinguish between what we mean by formal assessments and informal assessments. I mentioned this earlier in the semester. Formal assessments, as we just mentioned, included standardized tests or protocols. Informal assessments includes what I just described when I mentioned going into the cafeteria or going out on the playground. But all of this is the gathering of information or information gathering. And all of this information is part of the evaluation. Next, the OTA may assist in the process once he or she has demonstrated competency in administering the assessment or protocol. The OT is responsible for the interpretation of the data. So again, that's a review of the roles of the OT versus the OTA in the evaluation process. The intervention plan is developed once the evaluation is completed, and the OT determines clients' strengths and weaknesses and analyzes the areas of performance and context in which the occupations are performed. Intervention plan is developed with the client, there's that collaborative piece, to address those areas important to him or her. And sometimes the OT actually develops the intervention plan with caregivers or with the family members as well, based on what is important to the family or to the client. We talked about family-centered care, and what I described in terms of developing an intervention plan that, based on the goals that are important to the family, would describe family-centered care, which we discussed during our very last class. The intervention plan includes a description of goals and objectives of intervention. The OT may contribute to development of this plan following the establishment of the OTA's competency. Goals are designed to be meaningful, relevant to the client, measurable, and occupation-based. Now, I should mention here that there's a lot more to the topic of goals in terms of goal writing. However, that detail is outside of the scope of this class and will be covered once you're in your OT program. But just remember that goals are designed to be meaningful, relevant to the client, measurable, and occupation-based. So once the goals and objectives have been established, the intervention approach is developed. So noting that we're going into more detail about intervention, which is the second step in the OT process. The occupational therapy practice framework identifies 5 general approaches to intervention. And some of this will sound familiar because in one of the first couple of slides we went over, in starting with this recording, appear again here. So the 5 general approaches to intervention include create, establish, maintain, modify, prevent. Let's take a look at each one, each approach. Create or promote, which is also known as health promotion, is when the OT sets up a program or activity in hope that all who participate will benefit by enhanced performance. To establish or restore, otherwise known as remediate or remediation, the OT uses strategies and techniques to change client factors, to establish skills that have not yet developed, or to restore those that have been lost. Another approach, which is maintain, the OT provides support to allow the client to continue to perform in the manner in which he or she is accustomed. OT practitioners using this approach help clients keep the same level of performance and not decline in functioning. Modify, which is also referred to as compensation or adaptation. This is an approach in which activities are changed to perform them despite poor skill level. So in other words, although the client has a poor skill level in completing a particular activity, the demands of the activity are changed or modified or adapted in order to compensate for the client's poor skill level. So compensation refers to changing the demands of the activity or the way a client performs the activity. Lastly, prevent. The OT practitioner may help clients engage in activities to prevent or slow down disease, trauma, or poor health. And then you can see pages 86 through 87 for examples for each approach. Now let's take a look at the types of interventions. The OTPF lists the following as types of interventions. Therapeutic use of self. It's defined as the process of using one's interactions for the benefit of another, or the art of relating. I like to, in plainer terms, describe therapeutic use of self as using our own personal experiences to connect with and build a rapport with our clients. Also, we'll revisit and discuss therapeutic use of self in greater detail as part of therapeutic relationships, another topic later in the semester. And that's included in Chapter 16, in case you would like to take a look early on. Another type of intervention in OT is therapeutic use of occupations and activities. So that's pretty self-explanatory, using occupations and activities as a therapeutic method to improve performance. And then there's consultation, which includes the OT consulting, not necessarily providing a direct service, but providing recommendations without actually providing actual treatment, or again, a direct service for the client. An example of this would include an OT going into a classroom, a school-based OT going into a classroom and making recommendations to the teacher as to how to work or to have the performance of students improve on a particular task. But the OT isn't actually working directly with the clients. They're giving recommendations to the teacher. And lastly, another type of intervention is education. And we've talked about this, we've talked about this previously as far as how the OT can educate family members as it relates to diagnoses and prognoses for a condition that their particular loved one may have. And next would be therapeutic use of occupations and activities. A definition for this is that it refers to selecting activities and occupations that will meet the therapeutic goals. Other definitions included in your textbook that are related to therapeutic use of occupations and activities includes preparatory methods. which are defined as activities designed to get the client ready to engage in occupations, and may include such methods as stretching, range of motion, exercise, and applying heat or ice. It's designed to get the client ready for purposeful or occupation-based activity, and there are preparatory activities that should be conducted as part of the intervention session rather than making up the entire session. So I've talked about this on more than one occasion in class, but the term that you should remember is preparatory methods. So it's essentially what I just went over, which is that if we're using a piece of, say, TheraBand, which is, well, a better example would be the TheraPutty. Let's refer to the TheraPutty that I showed you in our lab, our first lab, our ADL lab. And I described the TheraPutty as having offering different levels of resistance for the person who's using it. And what I mean by that is that if we're working on hand strength, I may introduce a piece of TheraPutty and have the client warm up the muscles in their hands. And also, based on the resistance in the TheraPutty, it can also help to improve their hand strength. However, I'm not going to use the TheraPutty throughout the entire session. I may use the TheraPutty and have the client complete a few exercises, maybe rolling the TheraPutty out into one long string of TheraPutty, maybe twisting it with their hands, with both hands. So these types of activities, again, or tasks rather, will help them build up strength and help in their hands, and help also warm up the muscles in their hands. But it's in preparation to do something else, to perform a different task or engage in a different activity. And for a school-based treatment session, that task could be completing an assignment, a class assignment. But again, the key point is that this type of activity is only used as a preparatory method in order to prepare the student to engage in another task, an occupation-based task. And in this case, the writing task would be the occupation-based task. So again, definitions related to therapeutic use of occupations and activities. The next definition is purposeful activity, which involves choice, are goal-oriented, and do not assume meaning for the person. It leads to occupation and may be a part of the occupation. Practice, for example, practice folding towels is considered purposeful activity for the occupation of household maintenance. The purposeful activity in the example I gave earlier would be completing a class assignment. We mentioned consultation, which involves a type of intervention in which practitioners use their knowledge and expertise to collaborate with the client. The collaborative process involves identifying the problem, creating possible solutions, and altering them as necessary for greater effectiveness. So I may, as a school-based OT, collaborate with a teacher to identify what the problem is with the student, who is the client. And then together we may come up with possible solutions. And when providing consultation, the practitioner is not responsible for the outcome of the intervention. So here, the examples I provided would be school playground, and home modifications. So these are two other examples, or two other ways that an OT can provide consultation services. And I mentioned earlier in the semester that sometimes OTs consult on the design of a playground, the types of equipment that should be included on a school playground. So again, the OT would not be responsible for the outcome of that particular type of intervention, but they would collaborate with school administrators, etc., on the construction or the design of the playground. And then home modifications, oftentimes when people are discharged from the hospital or from the skilled nursing facility, they have to return home, and they may be in a wheelchair, so certain for example, that's just one example, a wheelchair. And so there may be certain modifications that need to be made to, say, doorways, and there may be a ramp that usually a ramp does have to be installed, and the OT may consult on that. Education involves imparting knowledge to the client or the client's family. Again, it's a type of intervention, and this intervention type involves providing clients information about the occupation, but it may not result in actual performance of the occupation. For example, the OT provides the mother with pictures of the proper way to position her child during feeding. So the OT, again, is educating the mother on how to work more effectively with her child, and when it comes to the self-care task of feeding. Education does not involve only the client, but may include caregivers. I mentioned that earlier, about the disease progression, symptoms, prognosis, etc. And lastly, the last step of the OT process is outcomes. Outcomes is important for OT practitioners to measure the outcome of their intervention and to determine whether the overarching goal of engagement in occupations has been met. So this is what we're saying, is that after we've done the evaluation, which includes all of the assessments, we've determined what the goals, we've collaborated with the family or with the client and or with the client to determine what the goals will be so that we can provide client-centered or family-centered care. And we've implemented the intervention. Now we're taking a look at the outcomes. How effective were those interventions, or were they effective? What do we need to change, to modify? Do we need to rewrite some goals? Do we need to add some goals? So we're actually now reviewing the outcomes, or considering what the outcomes are. And when we write goals, I should mention again, or emphasize, and you'll learn more about this in OT school, when we write goals, they have to be measurable. And because they are measurable, now we can actually take a look at what the outcomes are. The OT practitioner can measure improvement or enhancement of the client's ability to carry out activities of daily living, or what is called occupational performance. That's not a new term for this class. We've talked about that before. Occupational performance outcomes are the most commonly used outcomes in OT. So, for example, the client with post-hip replacement returns surgery home following OT services and with adaptive equipment to improve ADL performance. The client is able to independently function in the activity of dressing. So, in other words, in plainer terms, if we're looking at the outcomes for someone who has had a hip replacement, and let's say when they were at the hospital, maybe the OT at the hospital indicated that the client needed to be assisted in order to complete the toileting task. Perhaps the OT, before discharging the client, introduced a piece of adaptive equipment that raised the toilet seat for the client so that they could actually stand up from the toilet independently. So now, when the client goes home after they've had opportunities to practice using the toilet seat, maybe even practicing using a walker for support for when they stood up and for balance, other outcome measures used in OT include role competence, the ability to meet the demand of roles, which includes increased ability to adapt or change to varying situations. Client satisfaction, a measure of the client's perception of the process and the benefits received from OT services. Health and wellness, which we talked about at the beginning of the very beginning of the semester. Health and wellness refers to engagement in occupations and activities and how they influence a client's health and wellness. Health, more specifically, refers to the state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and wellness refers to the condition of being in good health. So, when we're taking a look at outcomes, or more specifically outcome measures in OT, we consider role competence, client satisfaction, health and wellness. And we also consider quality of life, or QOL. Quality of life is considered a desired outcome of intervention. Quality of life measures determine the client's appraisal of his or her satisfaction with life at that given time. Prevention of further disease and the promotion of a healthier lifestyle is a goal of OT intervention and impacts quality of life. So, final points regarding outcomes. Outcomes are defined from the very beginning of the OT process during evaluation. Practitioners select the types of outcomes and measures they will use to determine success. Intervention is focused on meeting desired outcomes and reevaluate the client's progress toward the desired goals throughout. Modifications to intervention and decisions, for example, continued intervention or discontinue intervention, about further intervention, are based on the client's needs and performance. So the 3 key points of the entire lecture on the occupational therapy practice framework include key point number 1, the OTPF is an official document of the occupational therapy profession, and it provides a description for OT practitioners, students, and consumers. The framework is comprehensive and emphasizes occupation-based intervention. Key point number 2, together the OT and OTA develop intervention goals by collaborating with the client. Once the intervention plan is developed, both the OT and OTA provide intervention that may include therapeutic use of self, therapeutic use of occupation or activity, preparatory methods, consultation, or education. And lastly, key point number 3, the outcomes of OT include improving occupational performance, role competence, and quality of life.